So I want to talk with you today about some of the work that I've been doing in the Andean Highlands. I've been doing research there for about 15 years, and I've been taking students actually to my research site in the Andean Highlands for the past 6 years. So I'd like to talk about Andean Highland women's perceptions of stress, using faculty-student collaborative research to develop a women's social stress scale. Applied anthropological perspectives are important and can be instrumental to help one gain a greater understanding of Andean cultural models of stress. The aim of this research is to examine social stress using cultural domain analysis. To identify what Andean Highland women regard as stressful, one must understand how the different areas of perceived social role stress are culturally shaped. One way is to define these areas as domains of agreement about particular elements of the cultural model of Highland life within Andean society. Data from multiple field seasons will be compared to determine a salient cultural model for social stress for women in the Andes. Students from East Carolina University learn the research methods of cultural domain analysis while studying abroad in the Calle Honda Huaylas of Peru. Students engage with local community members to gather cultural data on stress among Andean Highland women. Researchers have suggested that women in the Andean Highlands are disproportionately impacted by household stress. Cultural domains can help anthropologists begin to unpack the components of meaning that informants use to cognitively evaluate their society. The research methods of cultural domain analysis facilitate the investigation of culture on individual biopsychosocial processes. Life in the Andean Highlands is difficult, challenging, and physically demanding because of the living conditions of the high altitude and the heavy reliance on manual agricultural labor. Economically and socially conditioned physical and psychological stressors have forced Highlanders to adapt certain social practices to combat these stressful forces through gender roles and household unity. Gender roles are differentiated by one's contribution to the household production and one's contribution to the productive capacity of the household in the form of reproduction. Agricultural labor is a task that is performed collectively by both men and women in the Andes. It is based on household and communal organization, as other members in the community will often practice mutual exchanges of labor in the form of harvesting, planting, plowing, and pasturing. Working collectively is important in the Andes, whether it is participating in work groups or performing other types of reciprocal tasks. The Andean feminine gender role is defined by the characteristics associated with being a mother and a wife. As a mother, the Andean woman is a hard worker who takes care of and sacrifices for her children. She is most concerned about the well-being of her children and strives to treat them all equally. As a wife, she derives a lot of power from her central importance in meal preparation for the household. A Highland man and woman must work together as a yunta, and yunta is the Quechua term for the yoking of two bulls together, in order to survive in the harsh ecological and economic context of the Andes. The Highland populations of the Calle Honda Huaylas have developed cultural models for dealing with social stressors, such as economic hardship, and are thus able to survive in Peru under harsh conditions of social stress. The research was conducted in the Calle Honda Huaylas Valley, which is located in the department of Ancash in the northern Andean Highlands. And the valley is located at an altitude between 10,000 and 15,000 feet in elevation. Within the valley, 9 hamlets were selected for research. The hamlets are comprised of Highland farmers engaged in small-scale agricultural production. This research is part of a longitudinal study of stress among Andean women. Cultural domain analysis is a set of techniques for eliciting terms from informants for a specific domain and for eliciting the major dimensions of meaning from that domain. To effectively conduct research using cultural domain analysis, a process of tasks consisting of free listing and unconstrained and constrained pile sorting is used. These techniques help explore what the social roles of importance are in the Callejón de Huaylas. The purpose of the free listing of terms by informants is to elicit what comprises the elements of their cultural model of the domain. The unconstrained pile sort of the free list terms involves the informant sorting the free list terms into as many piles as they deem appropriate. The purpose of this task is to elicit the dimensions of meaning that individuals use to distinguish amongst the terms. Free lists provide a thorough list of terms, and then all of those terms are studied to determine what the terms actually mean. It was important for this research to have a sampling of the most common and also some of the terms used to generate greater contrast in the lists. For the unconstrained pile sort exercise, informants are presented with a set of cards for each domain under study and are instructed to sort the cards into as many piles as they think is necessary, sorting terms that are more closely related into the same piles. Additionally, informants are instructed that there is no correct sequence that the cards should be placed in, and they are told that the placement is solely based on their opinion. The unconstrained pile sort is an excellent way to obtain an understanding of the meaning of a list of many different terms. After the sorting of the cards, a full square similarity matrix of terms is calculated for each respondent. And this is consisting of each term and how it relates to every other term. The aggregate similarity matrix is then analyzed using non-metric multidimensional scaling to decrease the aggregate matrix into a two-dimensional map of the distances between terms. Terms that are more similarly related in meaning appear closer together, while terms that are farther apart are less similar in meaning. I wanted to point out here in this photograph, and I have some other images that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but I wanted to point out a couple key things. Number one, you notice that in both these images, we have men and women who are out in the field and they're actively participating in the harvesting of agricultural crops. So it's actually a part of both the masculine and the feminine gender role in the Andes to be involved in agricultural production. You also will notice that there's a lot of people in these photographs. In fact, a lot of these are my students that I've taken to Peru who are also then integrating into these work groups with local community members. And in order to do this type of agricultural work, you need a lot of people. And so there has to be some sort of cultural mechanism, some sort of social ties that people have to bind them together so that they're actually going to be able to accomplish this type of difficult work. And so we see that being enacted here in some of these photographs. In previous research, both Highland men and women were asked to discuss different sources of social stress, which included tasks associated with being a parent, a spouse, and a neighbor. These areas of social stress were explored with informants to determine a cultural model of Highland social stress. To examine social role stress, free lists were obtained in response to several questions concerning husband and wife relationships, mother and father relationships and social roles, and neighbor relations. Andeans identified 52 terms that they associated with stress and gender roles. And these can be lumped into the social roles of the spouse, the parent, and the neighbor. And so what we're looking at here is actually a free list of spouse social roles. And you'll notice on the screen that there are both positive and negative terms that were mentioned. And some of these terms are more specifically related to being a parent, and some of the terms are more specifically related to being a spouse. So, for example, you have terms like drunken, beating his wife. Those are obviously negative terms that are specifically associated with being a bad spouse. You have other terms like being liberal, being a gossip. Those are negative terms associated with being a woman in the Andean highlands. And then we have positive characteristics, things like providing for his family, looking after his home. Those are positive characteristics associated with the masculine gender role in Andean society and associated with being a good parent. And you also have characteristics like taking care of the husband, taking care of the children. Those are positive characteristics associated with being a good wife and a good mother in the Andean highlands. For the social roles of spouse, Andeans discuss good husbands and wives are people who take care of their spouses. For the mother and father social roles, Andeans discuss that parents should fulfill their social role by being concerned for the well-being of their children. These free lists were obtained in response to the following question. What is the difference between good men and bad men in the Callejón de Huaylas? And what is the difference between good women and bad women in the Callejón de Huaylas? Also, neighbor relations were a part of this research, and so we have specific terms that are associated with being, in this case, either a good or a bad neighbor. I'll just highlight a couple terms here on the screen. Someone who does not share their harvest, someone who throws rocks, that's a person who's a bad neighbor, right? You don't want to hang out with somebody who's going to throw rocks at you, and you also don't want someone to be to associate with someone who's not going to share what they're harvesting with you, because reciprocity, and I'll talk more about that later on today, reciprocity is a huge part of Andean culture, and so there has to be this sort of back and forth, this give and take. And so if you share your harvest with someone, you hope that in the future they're going to share their harvest with you. Positive characteristics associated with being a good neighbor. Someone who allows their neighbors to plant on their land. Once again, underscoring that reciprocal nature. Often people will share land resources that they have. A good neighbor is someone who helps to repair irrigation ditches. I'll be talking a little bit later on more about water and water scarcity in the Andes, but farmers need water, and so the water has to be brought through irrigation ditches that require work groups in the communities to be able to repair those ditches. Regarding neighbor relations, Andeans thought that a good neighbor is someone who will share their harvest and participates in reciprocal work exchanges by helping their neighbors plant and harvest their crops. Andeans were asked to talk about what the differences were between good and bad farmers in the Callejón de Huaylas. I have a couple other images here. Want to sort of highlight the importance of reciprocity in the Andes, as well as neighbor relations. On this first image here, this is actually one of my students who is learning how to use the yunta, which is the two bulls that are yoked together. That's the main way that plowing happens in the Andes. She's working there with a gentleman behind her named Claudio Galan. Claudio Galan is a key informant of mine, a dear friend of mine. I've known him for many years. And generally, when I take students to this part of Peru, we spend some time in Pampamaca, which is the town that he lives in. And often we're engaging in different types of reciprocal work exchanges with him. In this case, we're helping to plow one of his fields so that he can plant potatoes. You also see here in this image, there's a lot of people in the picture. We've got a large work group that's been assembled. Some of them are my students. Some of them are members of the community of Yupa. And we just actually in this photograph have just finished a hard day's work of harvesting oca and oyuco, which are two tubers that grow in the Andean highlands. Neighbor relationships are very important because when you're planting and harvesting, that's a very difficult type of work to be doing to start with. And it would be hard work to do at sea level, but we're actually doing it at 12,000 to 13,000 feet in elevation, which makes it even harder to do that type of work. And so you're going to need a lot of people to be able to come and help you, whether you're harvesting or planting. And so reciprocity and having good neighbor relations are very important in the Andean cultural context. Also see another image here of a different type of reciprocal exchange that's going on. This is a communal feast that my students are involved in. This is what's called a pachamanca. Pachamanca is a Quechua term that refers to earth, and basically means earth oven. So it's generally a feast that happens a couple times a year where they are going to prepare a lot of food, and that food is then going to be redistributed within the community. And the idea is that if your family is having a pachamanca, you're going to share your food with other members of your community so that in the future, when other members of the community are having their pachamanca or some other feast, they're going to share the food with you and your family. So once again, the reciprocal nature is showing up in this type of exchange. And so basically what happens with the pachamanca is my students go through the whole process. They prepare the pachamanca, which actually includes the potatoes that we harvested the day before. So we're sort of in the entire process, both harvesting and then also the preparing of the meal. But what happens is they heat rocks for a couple hours. The rocks are collapsed down. Different types of potatoes and other tubers are placed on top of them. Also, meat usually is a part of this, both it could be chicken or pork. Corn is placed inside on the rocks as well as fava beans. Then all of that is covered with herbs. They put blankets on top of those herbs, and then dirt is covered over top of that. And so it creates basically this earth oven where the heat is sealed in. It cooks for a couple hours, and then you go through the process in reverse, removing the blankets and herbs and so forth, and the food's extracted and shared with other members of the community. So once again, talking about or showing an example of the reciprocal nature of Andean culture and also the importance of neighbor relationships and maintaining those neighbor relationships. It's very difficult to survive in the Andes if you do not have good neighbors or if your neighbors don't like you. What we're looking at here is a model of the representation of both pile sorts of social roles in two dimensions, the free list that we were looking at earlier about the spouse, the parent, and the neighbor. Items that are grouped closely together in the cluster analysis appear in close proximity to one another on the model. It appears that one dimension of the model is the qualitative appraisal of whether a characteristic is positive or negative. Informants also seem to group characteristics associated with different social roles, whether it's the social role of a neighbor, a spouse, or a parent. For example, the group at the right represents bad characteristics. The grouping at the top of the negative pile contains characteristics such as envious that are associated with a bad neighbor. You do not want your neighbor to envy you. And in particular, people talked about neighbors being envious of another person's harvest, for example. That's considered a bad characteristic of a neighbor. At the left of the model is a group of positive characteristics. The organization of terms such as helping one's neighbor and inviting a neighbor to eat at the top of the positive group suggests that these terms are regarded as important characteristics of being a good neighbor. So a good neighbor is someone who invites you to eat and shares their harvest with you. The pile sort seems to suggest that neighbor relationships are very important in the Andean farming communities. The unconstrained pile sort suggests that there are both positive and negative models of social roles. The data suggests that there is disagreement amongst informants on certain terms. Like, for example, some people thought that hitting one's child was a positive term in the sense, I guess, that you're reprimanding them, and other people thought it was negative because it's not something that you should do in order to reprimand them. So there was some disagreement on that particular term. For example, a 64-year-old female farmer with 1 year of education described social roles by positive and negative qualities. And she talked about the positive and negative qualities of being a male, a female, and a neighbor in Highland communities. She said a good neighbor is someone who helps you. And she organized the piles of qualities of good or bad neighbors, men and women, together in different piles. She said a bad man is someone who hits his wife and is a drunk. All of these these particular characteristics, the hitting of the wife and the drunk, those terms appear close together in the model, which suggests that not only her, but many informants associated these characteristics with the negative male social role. My previous research identified this relationship between gender and social stress in the Andean highlands. It revealed that Andean highland women are often marginalized and not well represented in anthropological studies focusing on Andean highland culture. Because of this, I sought to identify what areas of highland social life are specifically stressful for women in the Andes. Using the tools of cultural domain analysis, students from East Carolina University participated in a study abroad program and were taught how to conduct free listing and pile sorting activities as a part of an ethnographic field school in the Andes. Students worked in research teams with ECU faculty to conduct interviews with 90 Andean highland women. Highland women were asked about potential sources of social stress specifically for women in the Andes. Informants generally appear to organize the social roles for Andean women but based on domestic and subsistence stressors. So what we're looking at here is now a free list that was generated directly from women about stresses and sources of stress that affect women in the Andes. And we have a variety of different terms that are included. Women talked about being stressed out about taking care of their children, being stressed out about having to cook for their family. They talked about being stressed because they do not have enough education, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough work. Those three terms tend to be interrelated, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. And they also talked about lack of water security. They talked about the stress of not having any water. Highlanders were asked to name various reasons why they feel stress in their lives. The free list was obtained in response to the following question. Why do Andean women feel stressed? 11 terms were listed by at least 20% of the sample. And after working with my research team, we determined that some lumping of categories was going to be necessary. And we also selected 2 additional terms of interest to include in the final list. So what that means is basically, sometimes you have terms that people mention that are basically mutually comparable. They're basically the same. And then you also have sometimes a term that is not mentioned by 20% or more of the sample, but it's actually a term that you think might be really significant, like the lack of water, for example. That was one that we decided to include. Here's a multidimensional scaling model representation of the pile sort, of the free list and pile sort data that's being shown in 2 dimensions. Items that are grouped closely together in the cluster analysis appear in close proximity on the model. It appears that one dimension of the model consists of the context the stressor is associated with, such as subsistence, domestic work, or the female gender role. For example, the group at the right represents stressors associated with domestic work and the household. The grouping at the top contains characteristics such as no school and no work, which are stressors associated specifically with women in the Andes. Women often lack the same opportunities that are afforded Andean men. At the left of the figure is a group of stressors associated with subsistence farming. And we have, basically no work, no school, and no money clustering there at the top, which I was talking about a little bit earlier. That tends to be something that women really are talked about a lot, and they really are experiencing that often. And then as far as subsistence goes, you have trouble, not being able to complete your farm work, not having enough water, and having a reduced harvest. That's something that a lot of women talked about was stressful. So all of this research led us to the creation of a women's stress scale, which I'm calling the Cultural Consonants in Andean Women's Social Role Expectation Scale. The final phase of the research was to develop this interview schedule to be used for the assessment of individual levels of stress for Andean women. One of the main goals of this research was to understand the degree to which individuals in their own behaviors approximate shared cultural models in these different domains of everyday life, which are also called cultural consonants. In prior research by Dressler and colleagues, cultural consonance was measured in the domains of social support and lifestyle. Dressler and colleagues used the generated answer keys from the cultural consensus analysis to determine which of the items were the most important. In my study, the same strategy was employed with respect to social role stress for Andean women. The systematic data collection techniques of free listing and pile sorting identified culturally important items for each domain. Subsequently, the ranking exercises indicated the best estimate of these evaluations. In the survey component of the research, I will collect self-reports of experiences of social stress. The purpose here is to measure the association of cultural stresses, also referred to as social stresses, with individual physiological and psychological processes. This approach is based on the interpretation of culture as a way to understand the relationship between individual behavior and aggregate cultural models. The purpose of this research instrument is to enable an investigator to gather data on self-perceived role adequacy and translate the data into numerical scores representing social stress specifically for women in the Andes. How can one assess the relationships between individuals and cultural models for social roles? As noted by Dressler, it would be possible to ask about individual behaviors, but in the case of social roles, this could potentially be problematic because one could be asking questions along the lines of, how often do you not have enough money? Or, do you care for your children? It certainly seems less plausible that these would result in valid measures of behavior. Modeled after Dressler's approach to deal with these challenges for the domain of Andean women's stress, I chose to ask about how the respondent feels she adequately addresses a characteristic in her own life. This would allow me to develop individual level items to include in the survey. I took the items or weighted word, and I took those items and weighted words from the cultural domain that I had explored earlier with the free listing and pile sorting. The cultural constants and women's social role expectation scale is comprised of 14 variables that have been modified to appropriately test for social stress among Highland women. The scale measured culturally agreed upon social role expectations. The social role interview involved women being asked 14 questions that were comprised of statements in which informants were asked to use a 4-point Likert scale to assess the level of agreement that they felt represented in their own life. Informants were asked about the subjects of stress associated with farming, the stress of the domestic household, and stresses specific to being a woman in the Andes. All the statements had to be reverse coded so that the consonant response would be elicited from the informant. For example, as with the statement, I sometimes wish I had more education. If an individual feels they have an appropriate education level, then they are consonant and would disagree with the statement. If they do not feel they have enough education, then they would agree with the statement. This technique is useful because if one were to be asked, do you have enough education? They most often would answer no, regardless of whether that was actually a true statement or not. In section 1, women are asked about stress associated with farming, which includes water access, harvesting, and farm work. These 3 activities are of tremendous importance to Andean farmers. These questions are measures of cultural consonance because an Andean farmer that is matching cultural expectations will have adequate water, they will be able to harvest enough crops, and they will not find farming hard work. Being unable to enact these agreed upon cultural models could potentially create a source of stress. The second section consisted of stress associated with the domestic household. The phrase, I sometimes find it difficult to cook for my family, addresses the issue of whether a woman is fulfilling a household duty assigned to women in the Andes. The consonant response would be to disagree with this statement, meaning that they are able to fulfill their ability to fulfill, that they are able to fulfill their social duty of cooking. Women also discuss being sick and how this impacted their ability to fulfill their social roles. Informants were asked, I wish I was sick less often. The constant response being to disagree, indicating that they are not burdened by negative physical well-being. Childcare is a duty associated with the gender role of Andean women and is difficult for women sometimes to accomplish. Women were asked, I find it difficult to care for my children, with the constant response being to disagree with the statement and to feel that you can always adequately take care of your children. Taking care of animals is also a task that's assigned to women in the Andes and is associated with the domestic duties of a woman. Informants were asked, I sometimes have trouble taking care of my animals. The constant response would be to disagree and feel that one is always able to care for their animals appropriately. The third section of the research scale asks about stress associated specifically with being a woman in the Andes. One statement in this section of the interview is, I sometimes do not have enough money. which addresses economic insecurity that many women talked about in the interviews. Women were asked about access to education, which is often unequal in the Andes, with boys being given educational preference over girls if the household has limited resources. The statement, "I sometimes wish I had more education," allows a woman to assess in her own life what she feels is an appropriate level of education. Spousal support is also important in the Andes, and couples must work together as a team to address the challenges faced in the marginalized environment of the Andes. Women were asked about spousal support in two ways. "I sometimes do not feel supported by my spouse, and I feel I need to have a spouse." The constant response would be to disagree with the first statement, to disagree with not feeling supported, and to agree with the second statement, which is to feel that they need to have a spouse. However, interestingly, there was some disagreement amongst informants about whether one actually needs a spouse anymore in the Andes. Women with more education and who were from less rural areas seemed to feel that having a spouse was less important. And women from more rural areas who had less education expressed that they felt that having a spouse was important. Not having enough work was a source of stress for many Highland women. Informants were asked, "I sometimes do not have enough work," with the constant response being to disagree and feel that one has access to enough work. Safety was also an issue discussed by Highland women, and many felt that feeling unsafe was a source of stress. Women were asked, "I sometimes feel unsafe," with the constant response being to disagree. Having a lack of opportunities was mentioned as a source of stress for Highland women. Informants were given the statement, "I wish I had more opportunities," with the constant response being to disagree and feel that one had opportunities. The cultural constants in women's social role expectations scale will enable future research that will enable individual levels of cultural consonance to be measured by assigning numerical values to answer choices in the scale. Social roles are challenging to understand, and social stress seems to manifest itself differently for women in the Andean highlands. When Highland women were sampled, various kinds of social stressors were identified, including stresses associated with farming, domestic stress, and stress associated with being a woman in the Andes. Each of these components of the cultural domain of social role stress were associated with culturally agreed upon social role expectations that one must meet to be a contributing member of a Highland community. Women seem to be impacted by stressors specific to the gender role of being an Andean woman. Many Highland women discussed few opportunities for women in the Andean communities because many women lacked educational knowledge and work experience. Many women in the sample had 0 to 3 years of education, and the disparity of lacking education left these women with feeling like they had few economic opportunities. Women also discussed being afraid to walk alone in the streets and on the mountainsides, especially during fiestas. The issues that are stressful for Andean women may also be potential stressors for Andean men, though to a much less degree than for Highland women. Women identified the spouse as a potential source of stress. Highland women both discussed being stressed about not being able to support their children and their family. Domestic stressors that seem to impact women were the stressors of taking care of the animals and children, which are both tasks which we mentioned earlier. They came out in the free list. Those are both tasks assigned specifically to women in the Andes, and they're difficult to accomplish. Subsistence farming is one of the main forms of income in the Andes, with harvesting, planting, and selling crops all being important. For Andean women, subsistence is a potential stressor since women regularly participate in farming practices. Many women discuss challenges associated with planting and harvesting their crops. Water was an important theme discussed by many women. They discussed the importance of having access to water, and many women also talked about the stress of lack of water in many Highland communities. Water is very important for farming, and there continues to be increased competition for this diminishing resource, both from the Peruvian government for hydroelectric power production and also from industrial agricultural production on the coast. Andean women are marginalized in Peruvian society and often are working under extreme conditions of social stress. Women are vulnerable to the stress associated with lacking education, lacking work experience, and lacking money, which can lead to a decrease in available opportunities. The data discussed in this paper represents a unique opportunity for understanding stressors that specifically impact Andean women. In the next phase of the research, the data from the Cultural Consonance in Women's Social Role Expectation Scale will be used to assess individual Andean women's levels of social stress. The data from the Women's Stress Scale will be compared to individual women's scores on the Cohen's Perceived Stress Scale to determine which is a better predictor of high levels of social stress. Understanding the individual experience of a disvalued state for Andean women gives further insight into the stress process and its potential impact for marginalized populations. Also wanted to take an opportunity to mention the Peru Study Abroad program that was a part of the collection of data for this project. I do plan to take students to Peru this coming summer during the second summer session during the month of July. If you have any students that might be interested in studying abroad in Peru, we spend the month of July in the beautiful Andean highlands, and we spend time working and learning about the culture of the people that live in the Andes. And then I would also like to extend a special thanks to my research assistants and interpreters, Dr. Rebecca Irons and Eva Vasquez. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And I'll turn it, I guess, back over to Holly, and we may have some questions.
Great. Thank you, Blakely. We really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I already know a lot about this project, so thank you. I think we're such a small group, people can ask their questions, but let me start with one that Helen Dixon put up in the chat, and I'll just read it, and Helen can interact with you if she has more to say about it. She says, sorry if I missed it, but were there any women surveyed who did not have children or a spouse or animals, women who did not live according to the traditional gender roles outlined in your questionnaire? And seems like your comments about not needing a spouse point to some changing values.
Yes, thank you for that question. So if you notice in some of the survey questions at the end, it starts at number 5. The first 4 questions are demographic questions, which you're asking about. So there were some women that did not have children that were a part of the sample. There were some women who were either widowed or for whatever reason didn't have a spouse. But as Holly pointed out about changing values, I've actually seen this with other kind of changes within the Andean sort of idea of the ideal life for an individual. If people are below the age of 40, there seem to be different ideas about what they should be doing in the Andean, to be a successful person in their cultural context. So in other words, people under the age of 40 might say you don't need a spouse anymore. They might say that you need to have a lot of education. They might no longer want to have land to farm, but they instead might rather have a taxi cab that they can use to earn money in the city. So they have different aspirations, whereas people who are over the age of 40 tend to have this other set of cultural sort of models and ideas about what they should be doing, and those might be more consistent with values that you would have seen in the Andes maybe for many years in the past. And they would probably include things like that you should be married and have a spouse, and that you should farm, and that you should have children, and so forth.
Yeah, in a way I can almost imagine there being a certain amount of stress accumulating in someone's life if they are not living up to those expectations. A totally different set of stressors, but related to reacting to those values. Yeah, thanks. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, you're exactly right. I mean, what we're seeing is that you've got sort of these 2 different cultural models, and some people think they should adhere to them, and if they are, then they're not stressed. But then the people that think they shouldn't adhere to that model are feeling stressed, And then there's the other model, and so there's these different ways that stress is starting to manifest as culture changes. I mean, I've been going to the Andes for 15 years, and when I used to go there in the very beginning, of course, no one had a cell phone in the Andes. There was very little internet access. And now, when I go, the farmers that I'm out in the field with, they have a cell phone now, and they have internet access in their town, and so there's a lot of changes that have come in that time period, which is introducing a lot of knowledge about the outside world, which, is maybe good and also could be bad in some ways. Thank you.
Blakely, I have a methodological question. I noticed on your stress scale, you got a 4-point Likert scale. Did you not include a, I don't know, or a, intermediate and in between the disagree and agree? And I just wondered what your thinking was on that.
Yeah, I didn't include that, and that's partially because in previous research, no one really ever chose it. Like when you translate it into Spanish, it didn't really make any sense to them. And people wanted to actually choose to agree or disagree strongly or not, or less strongly. But the whole idea of having that additional category to be kind of not having an opinion either way, no one ever seemed to really even understand it when we would ask it. So that's why it was left out.
That's interesting, because the problem you'll see in a lot of US-based surveys is people always answer that they don't know, or they're in between. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that has something to do with the fact that I'm working with people with, not a lot of education, many of them in a rural area in Peru. It might be totally different if you were interviewing people in, say, Lima, for example. But in the case of where I was working, that was what happened.
Anybody else want to ask a question or make a comment? Feel free.
I actually have one. This was fascinating. It reminded me a lot of some of the stories my brother used to tell me. My brother Stephen was an anthropologist who had gone to the Peace Corps and was in Huaraz. And he said that when he first got there, that a lot of the people in the community didn't trust him, and so when he would ask questions or try to help, that they thought he had some ulterior motive or something. Here was this American who came in there. But he said that his guide or companion there one time had a stomachache, and that Stephen had given him an Alka-Seltzer. And he put it in water, and the guy was amazed. And then he drank it, and he was fine. And my brother was treated like a god after that they thought it was some kind of magic. And that then people in the community started offering their daughters to him. And I thought that was interesting. First off, that they didn't trust him, and now they're like, here, please, as a reward, take my daughter. So I didn't know if that was still, this was in the late 60s, early 70s. Did you see any of that kind of mistrust of your students who were coming in, or have you been going there long enough that you've sort of set up a rapport with the community?
That's a great question. I mean, what you were kind of outlining or describing is really the process that anthropologists go through when we start doing field work, right? We have to go in and get communities to trust us, and also to try to be integrated into that community. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. So I think with some of the examples you were mentioning, that was probably what would have happened back in that time period. I actually am working in Huaraz as well, so that's interesting. The Callejon de Huaylas Valley is where Huaraz is located. So that's interesting. It was the same location. But in my case, first of all, I have been going to these communities for a long time. So often I know families in the communities, and they're familiar with me, even though they're not necessarily familiar with my students. But since I'm there, they associate my students with, right. And so then they usually trust us. But what I was actually asked to do, well, I did do it, and I think it's common for anthropologists. I think Kali even has some godchildren in Mexico. I have 2 godchildren that live in a rural village above Huaraz, and I was asked to become a godparent, and you go through a whole ceremony and everything. And the reason why that is happening is, number one, it benefits, of course, the children and the family, but it's also, in my case, because I am from outside of Peru, I have a higher social standing, and so it actually gives the family a higher social standing within their community, and it also enables the community to realize that I am someone who is trustworthy and allows me to be able to continue to do research there. So that's an example of a type of a sort of reciprocal relationship that I am involved in the community that helps people to be to understand what I'm doing there and to feel safe to work with me. But I think that what you were expressing about people being hesitant, I have experienced that. My students have experienced that as well before, when we go into a community and maybe they're working in different groups and I'm not always with all the groups. And so they might come up to someone and start talking to them. And before they are introduced and explain what they're doing and why they're often very skeptical of those people. And it's because, my understanding is talking to my informants, it's because there's a lot of people that come into these rural communities in Peru, in particular from the Peruvian government, from Lima, and they have various reasons to be there, various agendas, and people don't always trust them. They don't always trust their motives, and they're often sometimes, unsure of why those individuals might be there. And so they are sometimes skeptical of people that they don't know.
Absolutely. He was sent back in the early 70s after the earthquake and mudslide in Huaraz, and was sent back as part of the recovery team and to help them kind of recover from all of this, because the entire village was decimated. And he said that the real tragedy, yes, the earthquake was a disaster, but that the biggest disaster, and I think he ended up writing his dissertation on this, was when everybody left, that it was the influx of Western refrigerated units and all of these things that this community had never seen before, had never participated in. It was there for a couple of years and then it was taken away. And he said, so the real tragedy was, the community having to sort of adapt to, sort of influx of foreigners, and then everybody left and they went, okay, now you're on your own. So it's just interesting as an English person and not an anthropologist. It fascinates me. Maybe I'm a frustrated anthropologist. Sort of the community is here. So maybe in my next life I'll be an anthropologist. But interesting.
Yeah, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, in my next life, right? Anyway, but
the earthquake. I've actually studied I have studied the earthquake because it did happen very close to Huaraz. I always take my students to what they call Campo Santo, which is the where Yungay used to be located, the town that was below the mountain that was destroyed. And I talked to a lot of people about the earthquake and how that was a source of historical trauma. I didn't discuss that in my research here, and I wasn't not doing that most recently, but in the past I've talked to people about the earthquake, and it was a very traumatic event, not only because it was, as you said, a natural disaster, but also because of all the changes that happened following that, whether it was the influx of foreign aid and different organizations coming, and also just the fact that many of them had lost family members. And so the whole sort of social fabric of their community had to be kind of re-sewn together in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments, questions? Right. I would mention just, don't want to let this go by. This field school has been great. I know a lot of students who participated in it. It's, I don't want to say this in a negative way. Megan's on here, so, but some of our study abroad programs are in Europe, or some of them are travel tours, basically. This is a program where the students get to go to a part of the world and see how people really live. It's quite shocking to many of them, but they also get experience in how to conduct research. So I highly recommend this program if you know of students who might be interested. They've got to be a little adventurous to do it. So,
yes.
Anybody else?
Thank you for mentioning that, Holly. Yeah, I'm still optimistic that I'm going to be able to take students there this summer. I mean, that's still the plan right now. I know a lot of the study abroad programs are kind of in limbo because of COVID, but it is a great opportunity for students. And I've taken graduate students there as well. If you have any graduate students that potentially might want to do research in Latin America. And then also I've taken students from other universities. So that's actually was positive. for the ECU students, because many of them had to interact with people from very different parts of the United States and who also maybe had slightly different backgrounds than they did. And so that ended up being positive as well, in addition to going to study abroad.
Well, Blakely, thank you very much. We really enjoyed this, and I'm sorry I scheduled you opposite the inauguration, but I have recorded this, so hopefully we can make it available to people. And I'll just mention that our February talk on the 17th will be Jennifer Overstreet from Joiner Library talking about feminizing the word prisoner and women's experiences of the Holocaust. So we'll be having a very different topic. And thank you for all of you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was
Thank you
wonderful.
for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.